Hello from Tampa, Florida. We're really happy to be preparing this video for your conference. We would be a lot happier if we were there in person. We were very saddened by the turn of events, the weather problems that meant that we were unable to come there and be in person. We do hope, however, that we can come to Israel in the near future. That is certainly a priority of ours. We want to wish you the best at the conference. I just know it's going to be wonderful. And we want to thank McCall and everyone who worked so hard to organize this conference, and we look forward to hearing all about it.
I want to echo Carolyn's sentiments. It's with a deep sense of loss that we face this camera instead of facing all of you in person. We sometimes talk about storytelling as a performance that includes and involves very particularly the question, who's telling what to whom? And it would be a lot easier for us and more comfortable, really, if we had you here in the room and we could do this more as a conversation than as a presentation on video. But be that as it may, here we are in front of a camera. And I want to start to respond to the questions that we were sent by talking a little bit about 3 essays that formulated a kind of theoretical or conceptual framework for a lot of the work that Carolyn and I began to do in the 1990s. In 1984, I was invited to do an essay for the Handbook of Interpersonal Communication. And in that essay, I formulated a kind of tripart conceptualization of the different goals of social science inquiry. I had been educated as an empiricist in the logical positivist tradition as a graduate student, and as the years went on, I became more and more interested not so much in studying the laws of social behavior and generalizations that could be made from traditional research, but rather the whole process of creating meaning in social life. And I had been reading the work of the philosopher Richard Rorty in the mid-1980s, in which Rorty developed a kind of pragmatist orientation towards social inquiry. And it was Rorty's suggestion that unless we could agree on purposes, we couldn't really agree on criteria for evaluating those purposes. And it seemed to me that there were very different strains between social scientists on what the purposes of our inquiry are. And so in that series of essays, I began by stipulating 3 different legitimate purposes for social science inquiry. Prediction and control, which many of us were quite familiar with who went through educations in the social sciences in the 60s and 70s. Interpretation and understanding in the hermeneutic tradition, which was a very different set of interests and objectives, and the growing interest through postmodernism in criticism and social change. That became the background for saying, look, if your purposes are different, then the ways of judging how well you are achieving those purposes ought to be different as well. And I then went into writing 2 other essays, one that I called Theories and Stories, in which I made the argument that there was a false dichotomy between theories and stories, that if we look at the history of storytelling in the academy, even in sociology and anthropology, we can see that story, and as well as in literature, that stories can be very theoretical. If we look at novelists such as Dickens and the muckrakers of the early 20th century in America, we can see that those are highly theory-grounded ways of telling stories. And then later on, I wrote a 3rd essay, which I called The Moral of Stories. in which I suggested that, at least for the ilk of social scientists that I wanted to be and that I saw emerging in the aftermath of postmodernism, maybe what you would call post-postmodernism, there was a concern of how social science fit into a moral framework. That is, that the question how we should live, which is a moral question, was just as important as what we can know. And thus, in looking at personal narrative and what was to come in my relationship with Carolyn and the work that we were to do in the 1990s, it took a turn toward that question of looking at human suffering, looking at how we can help people, looking at activism and all those particular issues through the vehicle of storytelling and autoethnography.
Okay, so while Art is writing these papers and thinking these thoughts, what am I doing? Let me fill in what's going on in my life. I was educated as a sociologist and did my dissertation in an isolated fishing community as an ethnography. So I have always seen myself as an ethnographer. I began work at University of South Florida in 1981, and it was around that time that several things happened in my personal life that caused me to question some of the work that I was doing and really start moving in a different direction. My brother was killed in an airplane crash on his way to visit me, and at the same time my partner of 9 years was dying of a chronic illness. And I had been doing some survey research at that point in time on emotions, and I have to say that I just started to think, is this meaningful? Do I really care about what undergraduates have to say about jealousy, which is what I was studying at the time? And the answer was no. What I really care about is doing research that is meaningful for me and for other people. I care about trying to figure out how to deal with loss, which is going to happen to all of us in our lives. And I cared personally about how to get myself through this down period that I was experiencing. So I started to keep notes on my relationship with my partner, whose name was Jean. And I found the keeping of the notes both therapeutic in that it helped me to kind of set this aside and move on with my life and be able to make the kinds of decisions that I needed to make without the chaos of everything occurring in my head. So I found it therapeutic, but I also found that some of my writing I felt was the best sociological writing that I had ever done. And so my partner died, and I began to write. I had hundreds of pages of field notes, and I began, more than maybe closer to 1,000, and I began to write from this work. And after many false starts of trying to make it sociology, I just turned to writing it as a story. And this felt right to me, because my goal was to get my emotional experiences down on paper in a way that would evoke readers to enter my experiences, to feel what I felt, and also to anticipate their own experiences of loss or think about the experiences that they had had, to reinterpret them, reframe them, but somehow come to a place where perhaps we all could feel a little better, or at least that we were in companionship with each other. And that was the beginning of my writing autoethnography. I wrote the book Final Negotiations about my partner's death and our relationship, and also wrote a piece about my brother's death. Now, in the middle of all this writing, 1990, I was fortunate to run into this person sitting beside me. And you can maybe imagine, given his interest at the time and given my interest at the time, they just came together in a very big way. We also kind of liked each other, so that was nice. And we started a relationship, a professional and a personal one, and since that time have published several edited collections together trying to showcase the different forms that ethnographic writing can take, that included the personal, that were pieces that were written in a literary form or used visuals and so on. So that's, you want to add in here?
Yeah, I think I can come in with just a little story. Keep it
Yes.
small. The first time we met was at a lecture that Carolyn was given in, of all places, the business school at the University of South Florida. And I won't go into how I actually got to that meeting, but I was in the audience as just an onlooker, just a member of the audience. And here she was telling this story about her partner's death. And she was telling two things. She was telling a story about the details of her experience, but she was also putting it into the framework of what I, as I listened to it, was a very defensive presentation in which she was trying to defend the rigor and legitimacy of what she had been doing, partly because of the feedback she had gotten from people who had read some of the pages that she had been writing of this book. And I asked the question afterward, during the question and answer period, why are you so defensive? Can't you let the work tell the story? And this related very much to the project I was working on theories and stories, and it also showed something of the taken for granted assumptions about what is legitimate work in the social sciences, or what I would prefer to call the human sciences. Carolyn, it appeared to me immediately, was making the human sciences more human, and that to me was really important. So then we started this relationship.
And that was a huge turning point for me, because I went from trying to prove that my work was social science to just feeling like I wanted to do work that was meaningful to me and that seemed to have the possibility of making the world a better place to live in. I think we should, I do want to tell just one more story, but I just have to tell this one. And that is, after we met at the talk, and I wondered who this brash young man was who was asking me all these difficult questions. We talked and said that, decided that we would exchange articles. So I went to, the next day, I went to my mailbox, and there was an article from Art that he had written, and I thought, that's interesting, because my building was all the way across campus from his. And then an hour later, I went to my mailbox, and there was another article. And I'm not kidding you, this happened like 4 or 5 times, and I thought, this must be the academic form of flirtation. So immediately, I got together some articles and went across campus and left them in his mailbox.
Yeah, I was going to say there's always another side to the story, which was that I then had invited Carolyn to give me some of her writing. And what I found was a 600-page, yet-to-be-published manuscript that became Final Negotiations. And that was her reciprocity in helping to develop this line of academic flirting.
And we won't get further into that. So let's go back to the questions, because we do want to make sure that we address the questions that you asked us. And one of the first ones was definition of autoethnography. How do you define autoethnography? And I want to begin by saying I'm not big into, drawing lines and saying this is autoethnography and this is not autoethnography. So much of the definition is political. I mean, if you define, you have different reasons for defining your work in different ways. You also have different outlets for the work. So if it is defined as autoethnography, there are certain places where it might be published and certain places where it would be less likely to be published. But I have never felt like I had to draw a line between, say, creative nonfiction and autoethnography. If someone says to me, oh, you write creative nonfiction, I would say, thank you. Now, I'm in a political position as a tenured faculty member that I can say that. I understand that for graduate students and junior faculty, sometimes what things get called really matters in terms of whether they get tenure, or get a job, etc.
And just to tag on the end of that, if you actually go back and look at the work of the late 1980s, early 90s, and then into the late 90s when we started our book series, in the beginning we were talking about first-person accounts and personal narratives, and I had begun in 1990 to teach a seminar on personal narrative in the communication department, and it was just the way it evolved, discovering that there was this term out there, autoethnography, but no one had really exploited its use in a political way that called attention to a space in the academy that we very much wanted to open for this kind of work and the objectives that this kind of work wants to achieve. Now, if you actually look at what happened after the term autoethnography started to catch on, and the spaces that it opened, including the controversies over the term and the nature of the work and how to evaluate it, it did create this space, and it created a life of its own. So vocabulary has consequences. And now, as we look around the world at the many people in many different places who are using the term, who are doing autoethnographic work of different types, it, I think, demonstrates the importance of the terminology. Yeah.
And then the second part of this question was, what is the place of other people's stories in an autoethnographic study? And, the meaning of the term really is just the connection of self and other, the integration of self and other. And so for me, all ethnography, good ethnography, has some autoethnographic components. You use the self as instrument, and therefore anything that you are observing also includes your part in the participation. So, in addition, you never have the self acting in isolation. The self is always acting with other people, and so you cannot write good autoethnography without attempting to take the role of the others and bring them into the story as well. And we have all different kinds of autoethnography. I mean, my students do ethnographies, but they include themselves in, at the same time, they focus on the voices of the other.
And the other issue, of course, philosophically that was going on at this time was the concern for reflexivity and the positionality of the researcher. And this goes in line with what I have been writing and thinking about in terms of hermeneutics and interpretation and the construction of research narratives. How much should they include the researcher's positionality, emotionality, connection to the participants in an ethnography? And autoethnography opened this up as a much more direct, drawing much more direct attention to the question, why did you choose to study these people? What is it about your life? What do you bring to the interpretation of what you're hearing from interviewees, from the communities you study, from the cultures that you write about? And what is that engagement? As well as ethical questions that we're going to get to in terms of what do you owe the communities that you study to as a researcher? So the idea of the detached, apart, objective observer who just is a stand-in and doesn't really matter who the researcher is out the window. And now through the autoethnographic impulse, the personal narrative impulse, the aftermath of postmodernism, the question of the researcher's connection to the community and to the observations made had to be explicit.
Okay, now we're down to question 3, which is what kind of researcher is needed? And following along with what we've been saying, I want to say that a good autoethnographer has to be able to do at least 2 things. One is kind of get in tune with self, tune into what are you thinking, what are you feeling, how are you interpreting a situation, reflect on your own actions, your own motives. Okay, so you have to be able to do all that kind of internal stuff, but you also have to be able to step outside of that and look back at yourself as an actor interacting with other people, and then do all kinds of role-taking as well. A good autoethnographer has to be a good writer, and not all of us are. A good autoethnographer has to be willing to be vulnerable, because you can't just make yourself look good. So are you able to see yourself in a vulnerable light, present yourself in a vulnerable light?
And of course, autoethnography opens up a myriad of questions for graduate education and the education of new researchers. Now the question of writing itself as a methodology becomes an issue. How do you educate people to do this work, since the conventions, especially within the social sciences, of what is rigor and what is methodology have a very different conception? Writing is an afterthought when you think of yourself as a reporter, just somebody who is carrying the truth from the community to an audience. Now with narrative writing, and I think of an autoethnographer first as a storyteller, then the question of what is a good story and how can you tell a good story, well, that means students in being educated into this work need to read stories. They need to read literature. They need to practice writing. They need to interrogate work for how is this writer shaping this story, and for whom is it being shaped? How much detail should there be, and how is detail presented in the context of a larger story? How do you figure out what a plot is? How do you develop characters? These are all elements of stories which are not part of the conventional education of social scientists.
And so what becomes very important here is the audience. How is the audience taking in the story, and what is the audience doing with the story? And so our goal in good autoethnographic writing becomes more opening up conversations rather than closing down the conversation and telling you what it all means. I mean, my goal is I hope to present a story that you then take in for yourself and start to talk with other people about your own stories in relationship to my story, which is a way of knowing that we have not really taken into account in all of traditional social science.
When I was in graduate school, and when I first started teaching social science methodology way back in the 1970s, I'm dating myself, we used to talk about the received view of knowledge, in which the reader, the user of research, was simply receiving knowledge. With autoethnography and personal narrative inquiry, the positionality of the reader and of the audience is one of a kind of co-conspirator or collaborator in creating meaning. And we're not just asking what is, which has been the traditional science of social science. We're also asking the very important question, what could be? What kind of world do we want to shape? And how do these stories help us to interrogate and to investigate and to look at what kind of world can be created? Thus we have activist autoethnography. We have very political questions related to social justice and autoethnography, and questions that were not being asked in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. So certainly the question of purpose comes in here, and to answer the question of what kind of researcher is needed, we need to ask the question, what kind of social or human inquiry are we doing?
Okay, now we're at question 4, which is what kinds of issues or areas are suitable for autoethnographic examination. Do you want to start there? Or I can, if you want.
Is this the voices
this
that
is
are
4.
heard?
Yeah.
Oh, number 4, what to study?
Yes, let me start, and
Okay.
then you can jump in. You know, the question, I think the question here really is, does all of autoethnography really have to be about sadness and loss and trauma and death? And the answer, of course, is no. typically autoethnography has been about these issues and suffering, because we typically write when there is something that we want desperately to understand, something that we want to get through, we want to reframe, figure out. And suffering certainly is one of those things that we are all trying to figure out and figure out how to cope with. Loss. We're trying to figure out how to cope with not being there with you, which has been very difficult for us. And writing, you know, what happens, so yes, there is some autoethnography about happiness and, you know, good things, pleasure, but I will tell you that becomes more difficult to write than the suffering, because it doesn't have a built-in tension, for example. So it's hard sometimes to make the plot interesting. Also, when we're happy, when we feel joyful, we ordinarily don't want to then stop being joyful to go write, right? We want to just keep participating in the joy and the happiness. So there's less pull to write. But there's no reason why autoethnography can't be used for every kind of emotion and event. And indeed, if we had time, we could go through some examples of autoethnography, which is for the purpose of social justice, etc.
And I don't feel defensive at all about saying that suffering is at the core of autoethnographic work, and of course much of ethnographic work in terms of bringing in marginal voices or voices that have been silenced. The whole realm of social justice inquiry and a lot of activist inquiry has that precise ideal in mind. This is like, in my view, it opens up that space. Now, it does create a challenge, especially for younger researchers and graduate students who may not have had their own experience of loss to write about. And of course, those of us at my age who have necessarily, by virtue of just being old, experienced some of the suffering and tragedies of a normal life, to say nothing of an extraordinary life, may have more to write about. But nevertheless, we find that students who are drawn to this work and younger professors who are drawn to this work have a lot of interesting and important stories to tell, and through their own experiences find communities that connect, because all the work is relational. And so the first question we usually ask younger students, graduate students who want to do autoethnographic work is, who are the other people that are connected to the experiences that you've had and that you can make connections to? And that leads to some very interesting work.
Hi, we are now on question 5. I love this set of questions. Whose voices are heard and how? The vision of autoethnography is to give space to voices, experiences, and knowledge of people in the periphery. How does this square with the fact that because of its pioneering character, autoethnography is done mostly by people in power in the academy? Well, that I think is a very good question. I think it probably could be asked of all research, because you end up having people in the academy, whether they're doing autoethnography or something else, be the voices of the less powerful. We have tried in our work, well, first let me start by saying, we have a lot of student voices in our work, and I certainly don't think that they consider themselves part of the powerful. And other voices as well. We also have worked with people. For example, I'm working now with Holocaust survivors, and I'm hoping that I get to talk about this more at the end. But my goal here is to work with them to bring some of the techniques that I've learned in doing autoethnographic research, and some of the sensibilities as well, to their stories, to work with them in a dialogic context to help them, or to work with them as they tell their stories. So I don't think that you are just hearing the voices of the powerful, or having the powerful be the authorial voices for the marginal.
And I guess I can add to that the notion that it was never our intention from the beginning to suggest that autoethnographic work was the only thing that social scientists or human scientists should be doing. The question of power is always a relational question in the way that I look at it, and the way one of my mentors, Gregory Bateson, looked at it as well. You're talking about a relationship between a person and other persons, between a community and other communities, within a community. And when I think of the power invested in being a tenured professor, senior professor, I also look at that power as an obligation, as a moral obligation to do what we can do through our work to open up the possibility of speaking these voices, sometimes invisible, sometimes silenced, sometimes marginal, and bringing those into a larger conversation. So I think autoethnography actually exploits the power that we have. If the suggestion of this question is that we are only telling the stories of elitist professors, then I think we are doing a poor job of showing what autoethnography has thus far produced, because that doesn't seem the case. And if we were there to actually engage this and talk through explicit examples, I think that would be seen. The other the question raised by a lot of these sort of critiques of the difficulties of autoethnography or autoethnographic work is that they also show, as we actually look closely at the implications of the questions, what the orthodox norms of the academy are. And from the beginning, it was our goal, and I think to some extent we've been successful at that, of breaching the orthodox, sometimes silenced norms and ideals of academic work. And the question that we all have to ask is, as a professor in a powerful position who mostly communicates with other professors, do we even know how to talk to the people on the street, to the people that need our help?
Okay, and the second part of this question, which I also love, it is claimed that autoethnographic text problematizes the notion of textual authority, but it seems that readers often take up and interpret first-person narratives as realist narratives about the self, an essentialist self who often goes unexamined. How can we reconcile this discrepancy? And I have to say, I've heard this criticism before, and I have taken it very seriously, because I think that in some cases in autoethnography that is true, that's what has seemingly been done. I have a fairly new book called Revision, and in that book I really tried to address this criticism by taking some stories that I had written in the past and going back to them and looking at them in different ways, looking at how I interpreted what went on, what I told and what I didn't tell, why I might have told it the way I told it at the time, given what was happening to me, the relationships that I had with the other people in the text, and so forth. And then, in some cases, I also looked at the critiques of the work and how I had presented the self. And then I tried to retell the story in some cases, or re-examine the story in terms of the changes that I now saw that had occurred between the time of telling the story and now, and to try to interpret why those changes had occurred, why my interpretations had changed. I also tried to look and really take into account what other people had said, whether they were people who were involved in that particular story as characters, or whether they were critics of that story. And so I wanted to show the self more as moving in time, as changing, as being constructed and reconstructed in the telling of the story. So I'm hoping that that book does address some of the criticism and does help to move us into a space where we are making the self a little bit more fluid. I think we have a few more minutes. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, like anything else, there's good work and there's less good work or even bad work. And I don't know whether the question implies the essentialist self as a criterion for good autoethnography or the distinction between good and bad autoethnography. As I understand it, as I read it, and as I'm often asked to critique it, the whole question of contradiction, ambivalence, uncertainty, difficulty in the face of loss, these are all the puzzles to which autoethnography addresses the lived life of suffering. And if one is not able to penetrate in a questioning way, to display subjectivity on the page, then what is left is a kind of essentialist self that you're talking about. But I would say that might be one of the issues in talking about evaluating autoethnography, and not so much a question of whether autoethnography in its total actually does this. So we would have to look at cases and criterion in those ways.
Okay, question 6 is a question about relational ethics. It seems that there's little guidance in the autoethnographic literature regarding ethical issues. Is relational ethics enough? That also is a wonderful question. I wrote a piece about relational ethics in autoethnography and ethnography, as a matter of fact, talking about how IRBs, that's institutional review boards. I don't know if you have them in Israel or not. Probably you have some equivalent. But they really deal with procedural ethics, but they don't tell you how to act relationally, and they don't tell you how to act situationally. And those are things that you have to decide yourself when you're involved in a research project. I emphasized the importance of relational ethics in this piece and thought that I had some understanding of ethics in research at that point in time. And then I had a situation, and I think this is always true of ethics. Ethics is a process. It doesn't stay, ethics do not stay still. And that certainly happened to me. I just decided to write a story about some events that happened to Art and me at our second home, which is in the mountains of North Carolina. And there were some people who lived in the area who had very extreme racist attitudes, really negative toward African Americans. And we had some conflicts with them. And I decided to write about this. And then, of course, I was faced with the ethical issue of hey, I'm not being relational. I'm not making sure that I am okay with the people that I'm writing with, that they are okay with what I'm writing. And I finally, after much, much thought in writing, had to say to myself, sometimes there are more important values than just my particular relationship with one person. And in this case, I really felt it was important to write the story of racism because I felt that people in our country needed to know that that kind of racism still existed. And I also felt that because I was part of this community and had grown up in a community that was very similar to this in terms of values about race, that I, who had been an insider at some point, really had the responsibility at this point to try to bring this message out into the world and to continue to talk back to the people who were in the community. And so at that point for me, social justice became a much more important value than relational ethics.
And that in itself is a discovery of the research. The question of ethics in autoethnography, as well as in all qualitative research, is incredibly important. And my take on it at this point is the search for universal ethical principles that can be applied in every situation is not a very useful way to think about ethics, that there are always contingencies, the kind of contingencies that Carolyn's case points out. And I'm much more inclined to think of ethics narratively, narrative ethics, in the way that Alistair McIntyre talks about it in After Virtue, and the way that Richard Zahner in Conversations on the Edge actually practices it as an ethicist at a university hospital, Vanderbilt Hospital. And his model of working through ethical dilemmas as an ethicist, making life and death situations in hospitals and trying to help people is a very good model, I think, for how autoethnographers ought to work through the dilemmas of ethical practices. This is a wonderful question and one worthy of a great deal of conversation among practicing ethnographers and qualitative researchers. There are no easy answers, easy situations. The most important thing is to see it as a puzzle and as something that has to be worked out in the context of the particular project.
Okay, question 7 is about evaluation, which I think we've touched on a number of times. Do you want to say just something briefly about the criteria we use to judge autoethnographic work?
There was a symposium in, I believe it was 2000, that was published in Qualitative Inquiry, in which a number of people doing the kind of autoethnographic and storytelling work that were associated with Norman Denson, Laurel Richardson, Carolyn and myself contributed to. And I wrote a little piece there called Criteria Against Ourselves, in which I tried to point out that criteria are a human creation and not something endowed by the heavens. I also tried to stipulate a number of things that I look at in autoethnography when trying to judge its merits, such things as abundant concrete detail, the representation of flesh and blood emotions, a layering of the academic and the personal, the emotional credibility of the autoethnographer, and the ability, which I mentioned before, to dig deeply into one's own subjectivity and to show the contradictions, the ambivalences, the difficulties that one experiences in these circumstances. But I'd highly recommend looking at that whole symposium for the different views about judging autoethnography.
Okay, and question 8 is about respectability and recognition. With autoethnography on the one hand and performance on the other hand, are you not worried sometimes that the respectability of social research in academia is compromised? What can we do against it? Do you want to start?
Well, if we're looking at the old ways of reasoning about truth with a capital T, then I think it is a legitimate worry. However, I think the question implies more about the university and of what counts in the bureaucracy of the university and the standards that historically have been used to judge work than it actually does about the work and the spaces that have been opened up by this work. The most important thing we can do, I think, is to, on every occasion possible within our own institutions, to present the best of this work in a very, very visible way that has as its goal, one story leads to another, to invite other stories. And if we begin to see the evocative qualities and the goals of evocation and multiple storytelling, multiple representations, and the co-construction between audiences and autoethnographers, then I think more people will understand what the merits of this this work can be. And if you look back on some of the books in our book series, you can see, for example, in Standing Ovations, taking what was a stage performance of ethnographic work on metastatic breast cancer to the community and to other doctors, and showing how those performances actually opened up possibilities for people whose own stories had been silenced to share those stories in a public way, and the importance of that kind of community as associated with this work. So I'm not really too concerned about that question, because our experience is, at least in the circles that we travel, that people are listening and are giving this work credibility.
I encountered this question back in the 1980s when I first started writing in a literary way, and had people say, well, that's fine if you have to write about your experience, but it doesn't tell me anything about mine, it's not generalizable. And other responses of, well, that's not really research, or that's not really sociology. And at that point, prior to Art and I getting together, I did feel defensive, and I felt like, oh, I want to persuade you that indeed what I'm doing is social science. Please let me into your world. Let me be a part of it. And, you know, I had certain turning points, one meeting Art, and one review that I got from Norman Denson telling me that I was schizophrenic, trying to use social science, use humanities and turn it against itself. That really led me to change my orientation from let me into your world to who in the world wants to hear this, who wants to do this, with whom can I have a conversation about this work. And that turned me outside of a discipline to really connecting with people in all kinds of disciplines in all countries who were interested in doing work that was meaningful. And so now when I do my work, I ask the question, does this mean anything? Will it do anything important? Does it have the possibility of doing anything important? Does it really jive with what I think we need to be doing as human beings in the world? I am not interested in doing research for research's sake. I am not interested in doing research because someone else labels that as important. I'm interested in doing work that I feel in my heart is an important kind of work to do. I also want to say that we go to the Congress in Illinois every year, and there are 1,000 people from many, many countries who are all doing this work and certainly don't question its legitimacy.
And that brings us finally to the last two questions. One, what did we have to go through at USF in order to get recognition, and what is the future of autoethnography? That's a lot to cover in the limited time we have left, and I hope this will be a conversation at the conference that other people can participate in. We went through very little at USF. We were a new program, and we developed a PhD program that has no quantitative faculty, and yet is situated as a human science with connections to other humanities as well as other social science disciplines. And in the last 3 weeks, we've had to review 70 applications for 9 assistantships in our program. So our program is very vital and very much drawing interest, and our students get jobs, and that's very important. Did you want to talk a little bit about the future?
Well, I wanted to very much to talk about my project with Holocaust survivors, which I'm calling Collaborative Witnessing. Survivors of the Holocaust Interpret Their Lives. And I so much wanted to be in Israel to talk with all of you about this, and also I wanted to, there was a woman that I was going to interview there who is a sister of one of our survivors in the Tampa Bay. But again, we will be there in the future to continue doing this work. But what I'm trying to do in this interview project is to integrate the roles of storyteller and story interpreter. I mean, what we have typically done in the past is the storyteller owns the story. The survivor owns the story. The survivor tells the story. And then we, the authority, interpret what the story means. And I have wanted to combine those two things so that I would work over a long period of time with survivors, and I know there have been a few people who've done some of this work. I want to work with them in a conversational format where we co-construct the stories together and then we interpret what the stories mean together. Then the stories would be written in more of a narrative form, hopefully in an evocative way that would bring people into the story, perhaps in a different way than our typical oral histories do, which tell the story chronologically. And I have so much more that I want to say about all that and about oral histories, but I'm going to stop and hope that this makes you interested enough to invite us back again so that I can continue talking about this work.
And I've been working on a book I'm about halfway through called Tales Out of School, Method and Meaning in a University Life. The reason I decided to do this book was a little passage in Dan Rose's book, Living the Ethnographic Life, in which he says, too few professors tell the story of what the university is really like. And a lot of the questions posed to us today really come out of the framework, as I've tried to suggest, of what the standards and norms and practices of a university life have been. And by telling detailed stories that reflect on 35 years as a university professor and the movement from being a positivist to what I would call the stance of the storyteller, has as its goal trying to show and also to reform the university in some of the ways that have been suggested in our narrative today. I want to thank all of you for thinking of us and allowing us to share these thoughts and experiences with you, and I can't wait to meet you personally in Israel sometime in the near future.
Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.